Welcome back to the Growth and Gratitude Podcast. I'll share 3 things that I am grateful for, and then I'd like you to think about 3 things that you're grateful for. I am incredibly grateful for my certification with the International Coaching Federation and the fact that 3 years into being certified, they are having me go through a very rigorous recertification process that involves being mentored, continuing education, having my recorded coaching sessions critiqued, and a lot more, and it's helping me grow and learn so much. I'm also grateful for my certification with the Life Coach School as a coach, also a very rigorous training program that I'm required to recertify with every year, and I learn so much from the support that they provide for ongoing education is phenomenal. It's a great program. And lastly, the third thing that I am grateful for is my clients who hire me to coach their teams. I know I've said before that I'm very grateful for the clients I get to coach, but I also want to thank those clients who hire me to coach their entire team and who hire my company to coach their entire team, because it allows me to bring on coaches who I adore to do work for my company and to just be of more help in the world during these times when people need so much support with their emotional health, their mental health, their professional and personal development. So I'm really grateful to those of you out there, if you're listening, who hire us for ongoing coaching for your teams. It's incredibly rewarding. Now, I titled this How to Be a Great Coach to Get Your Attention. And I am going to talk about the 3 core skills for being a great coach, but I want to kind of amend that or offer a couple of little caveats at this point. And one is, I'm not saying that I'm a great coach. First of all, I am striving to be a great coach, constantly learning and growing after decades of coaching people. And I'm not saying I'm there yet, but I'm striving for it. So that's why we're talking about how to do it. And I'm not saying certainly that after listening to this one podcast episode, you will automatically be a great coach. But again, I am saying that if you really take a look at how you're practicing the 3 skills that I'll cover and where you have room for growth, just as I do in all 3 of them, then you can, along with me, strive to keep getting better and better as a coach. And who can you coach? You can coach anyone. You can coach someone who works on your team. You can coach a colleague. You can coach upward. You can coach across. You can coach anyone in your organization if you're a good coach and if they're open to coaching. You can coach a family member. You can coach a friend. It's just an approach, a particular approach to providing support for someone who could use your support. And it's a very unique approach that's widely misunderstood, which is why I am offering this podcast today. What are the benefits of coaching? They are endless. I have been coached for many years. I've also been in therapy. I've also had many mentors. There are lots of forms of support that I am a huge advocate for. But coaching, as I said, is very unique. And when we coach people, we empower them to come up with their own solutions to their challenges. We empower them to really think through how they're thinking about situations, how they're acting in situations, how they can look at options and how they might not be seeing the entire picture, but it's very much eliciting the person's problem solving in their own situation and drawing out of them ideas and thoughts and ways that they can frame things and take action on things to get the results that they are looking for. So it's a very active kind of a process where we're both incredibly engaged, as opposed to teaching, let's say, where you're just sharing your information and the other person is just a passive recipient. This is a very, very engaged, co-created experience. So what are my credentials? As I already mentioned, I'm certified with the Life Coach School. I'm certified with the International Coaching Federation. I was a professor for 28 years, so I coached many of my students in office hours and outside of class and colleagues as well. As you know, I have many years as a trainer, training designer, and training facilitator, and also coach. I often coached people who went through those programs who wanted more support after the program, and have always been a one-on-one coach in some way, shape, or form. But what's interesting is that I really didn't develop a true deep appreciation for the unique approach that coaching is until I went through these certification programs over the last 5 years, because coaching is not the same as mentoring. It's really, really different. And so I now realize that many of those hours I spent for years in office hours or chatting with clients after classes was more mentoring than it was coaching. So I want to start by differentiating coaching from mentoring and therapy just briefly. There's so much more I could say, but I want this to be a short and sweet podcast. So I'll briefly differentiate, and then I will get into the 3 skills. So mentoring versus coaching. A mentor is typically someone who has much more experience and knowledge and expertise in a particular area and is basically teaching you and helping you learn the skills that you need in that particular area. So I might mentor someone on their public speaking skills by sharing what it was like to give my TED Talk and the things I've learned over my many years of being a public speaking instructor. Or I might mentor someone on intercultural communication because that was a course I used to teach, and I know a lot of models and frameworks and ways to facilitate discussions around that. So that would be more mentoring, where there's that experience and that expertise, that teaching. Coaching, on the other hand, believe it or not, in true pure coaching, which very few people practice, but some do, there is no advice. It's purely eliciting out of the person their own answers, their own solutions, their own insights and profound realizations, but it's drawing things out, and you don't necessarily have to have experience in the particular area that the client is talking about, because you're just facilitating their own growth and discovery process. So mentoring, coaching, very different. Coaching and therapy. Lots of differences, lots of similarities, talking and having a safe space and no judgment, and someone who knows how to actively listen, and someone who has a lot of awareness, self-awareness, and helps you develop self-awareness. And a lot of the skill set, the 3 skills I'll talk about, are present in coaching and therapy. But of course, therapists have much more training in a lot of areas that coaches don't receive any training in. Therapists are far more educated. They usually have a PhD or are licensed marriage and family therapists, which is usually allows them to only practice in one state, or they might have multiple states, but they have to get different certifications. Whereas as a coach, I can practice anywhere in the world. I have clients in Europe and all over the US. So the strict requirements and education and certifications of being a therapist you can't even compare being a coach to those. And I'm a huge fan of therapy, and I'm a huge fan of both. Many of my clients are in therapy and coaching simultaneously. Some of the big differences are that, of course, therapists are trained and educated in diagnosing and treating concerns such as PTSD and other forms of trauma, addiction, abuse, deep healing work from childhood challenges and struggles, and realizing patterns. And therapy usually goes into much more depth into the past and looking at how past patterns and our upbringing and the things that we've learned along the way and our caregivers imparted have impacted our lives now. There's often a lot of healing work that's needed and deep support, and someone who's really educated in how to walk through those really challenging kinds of processes. Now, in coaching, typically people are functional. They're doing pretty well. So whereas therapy can help people with significant lack of ability to function, when someone comes for coaching, when someone signs on for coaching, usually they're doing all right. They may even be doing well, but they're looking for support with the present and the future. It's also kind of time bound to do better, to reach their goal, to set and reach goals, to break through obstacles and barriers that they may have been facing for years, to really reach that next level. And I know therapy can help with that as well. So I just want to acknowledge those differences as a really just a starting point. There's a lot more to it. You can learn a lot more about those differences in the webinars that I have offered in the past that are on my YouTube channel. So I'm going to make sure to link those. I have a couple webinars that go into much more detail about coaching versus therapy. What does a coach do? How to figure out if coaching would be helpful for you. So I'm going to direct you to those resources for more on this. But let me get into the 3 skills. They're not going to be a shock to you, but I really want you to think about and do a little self-analysis. Look honestly at how well you're doing, because as I've been engaged in this, as I said, mentoring process to get recertified I've really had to look at and have a mentor coach watch my coaching sessions, my recorded coaching sessions. I've really had to look at how I can do even better as an active listener. Most resources you look to about coaching, about what great coaching looks like, will say that the coach should be listening about 80% of the time and only talking 20% of the time. This is another big difference between coaching and teaching, mentoring, other forms of support. We're mostly listening when we coach. We're creating that safe, non-judgmental, really engaged space for the person to just talk things through. Don't you find that so helpful to just be able to talk it out? As people talk and listen to themselves, they will have the most profound epiphanies. And sometimes I hardly need to say anything. And people say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize I was thinking this. I didn't realize this is why I was doing this. I didn't realize that my motivation wasn't at all where it needs to be to do what I actually want to do. So just that space to listen and let someone talk it through. No interrupting, no checking your email or being distracted. If you're on Zoom, if you're in the room with someone, full attention, full focus. That's what true active listening is. Now, for me, one of the things I know that's really hard for all of us to be able to do that really true 80% listening and just hold that space for the person is we'll think of a question or we'll think of something that might be helpful. So my clients know as I'm coaching, I'm always taking notes, just very brief little notes. But if I think of something as you're talking while I'm coaching you, and it's something I don't want to forget that I might want to bring up or ask you about, I'll just type it in a couple words in my notes and then come back to you and be fully focused on listening to what you're saying. Now, the second skill is paraphrasing, saying back what you've heard. Now, we don't parrot back every single thing we hear, but as a coach, when you're coaching, you're being a detective. You're listening to hear things that seem significant, that seem concerning, that seem contradictory. So one of the important things we learn in coach training is if you hear someone saying two different things that seem contradictory, try to call that out when you can, not interrupting, but to say things like, okay, I heard you say that you love your job. And I also heard you say that you need to find a new job. And then just leave it. Just leave it. Don't say a whole bunch more. See what they say about that. They will usually come back with, did I really? Did I say I love my job and I need to find a new job? Let me think about that. Well, these are the things I love about my job. And these are the reasons I'm feeling antsy and wanting to just point out, say back what you've heard when it would be helpful, when it would be insightful, when you think that the client might not be aware of what they're thinking and what they've said. And say back to clarify as well. So it sounds like you're saying what you're most upset about is that your boss didn't recognize how much work you put into the project. Is that right? They might say, I get it that that's what it sounded like what I'm saying, but that's not what I'm upset about. What I'm really upset about is this. So that paraphrasing really helps us to keep diving deeper to help people see what they're thinking, feeling, saying, doing, and to check in about what's really going on for them. Okay, so much more I could say about that. So many other ways to paraphrase. It's an incredibly underused skill. We talked about this in all of my communication courses when I was teaching and in the training that I do. Just take a breath, skip a beat, really process what you're hearing the person say and say it back to them just to check in and see what they think about that and see where else that can take you. Now, the third skill is helpful questions. Oh boy, am I still working on this one? And I have lists of questions. This is a list of questions for clients from Life Coach School. I'm constantly looking at lists of great questions. So there are lots out there. You can Google great coaching questions. You can come up with your own great coaching questions. But boy, have I learned, but I cannot tell you how much of what determines whether or not our coaching is great, is not great, mediocre, or really great is the quality of the questions we ask. And there's so much to that again, but just some basics. We want to avoid why questions because they can make people feel defensive. Just a simple example. Why did you say that to her? Versus, what were you thinking? What were you feeling when you said that to her? What were you thinking when you said that to her? Versus, why did you say that to her? So just be aware that why tends to create defensiveness. How can we phrase a question starting with what or how? Something open-ended. Did you want to get that result? That's not a great question. What result were you looking for in that situation? Because if you say to me, did you want to get that result? Well, yes or no. My brain goes to yes or no. What result were you looking for in that situation? Hadn't thought about that. What was I trying to? Well, I guess if I really wanted to have the result that I was looking for, I wouldn't have taken this action. I wouldn't have said that to the person, whatever it may be. So good questions are open-ended. They avoid why. They really get people to think about the issue. Something that has been so helpful for me that I learned in my coach trainings is ask questions that the client won't immediately know the answer to. If it's an easy question to answer, it's not helping me dive deeper. So ask questions that the client has to struggle with. Like, what do you really think was going on inside you in that moment? Oh gosh, what do I really think was going on inside me? Well, it was really triggering my old memories from childhood. Now, I know I said therapy is more about that, but I'm a big fan of bringing up the things we've learned in therapy in coaching. My clients know that. And as I said, most of my clients are doing both simultaneously. So we can draw on those new pieces of knowledge to help us understand what's happening in the present and what we want to happen in the future. So don't ask questions that are easy to answer. And also don't ask questions that are just for your own curiosity or because you want to know a detail about something. Well, how old were you when that happened? That might be a question that I would probably be asking out of my own curiosity, unless it's particularly relevant, versus like, how did that impact you? How do you think the impact of that event in your life informs the choices that you make today? Is there a connection? Is there a connection was a yes or no question. So see, I don't get it right all of the time, but I'm constantly trying to refine and get better and better at it. Another important thing about questions is that questions should be used at key points in a coaching conversation to guide the conversation and to make sure that it's as productive and helpful as possible in achieving whatever the goal is. So we are trained in coach training and most coach training programs to really kick things off with a clear question about where we want where the client wants the session to go. So I might start with something like, what would be helpful to talk about today? Or what would you like to accomplish? Or what would you like to walk away with by the end of this coaching conversation today? And the client usually knows, but sometimes they don't know. And I'll say, just take a minute. Don't say the first thing that comes to your head. Take a minute, close your eyes if you need to, take a breath. Think about what would be most helpful to walk away with out of the conversation today. And the ways that clients answer the question about what they'd like to get out of the session or what would be helpful to talk about often surprise me. And that's why it's important for me not to be the one who determines that. And for the client to tell me what I'd like to get out of the end of the session, if possible, is to have 3 options to start considering, or to feel better about this situation, or to have a plan to talk to my boss about the raise I want. It could be something very tangible. It could also be, I just want to think differently about something I can't control and that I'm ruminating and stressing a lot about. So you get to define what you want to get out of the session, and the coach should be asking a great question to help bring that to the surface. It's also really important for the coach to know when it's a good time to ask questions to guide the conversation in the right direction. So if a client's going off track or getting into the weeds, I might say something such as, what would be most helpful at this point to talk through, given that by the end of the conversation, you wanted to walk away with some ideas for how to solve this problem. So guiding questions, keeping things on track, and then questions to dive deeper. So sometimes a client will just start crying in the middle of talking about something and it comes out of the blue. And that's always a good thing, in my opinion. When emotion comes up, we want to look at it and see what's going on there. And I might stop and say, what's coming up for you? What's going on that's bringing up this emotion? And just let them talk about what's coming up. And that could offer some new insight into what that person wants to achieve in the session and what's really going on. Sometimes what they come to talk about isn't what the real issue is. And so another question that's sometimes helpful is, what exactly is the problem here? Sometimes clients will circle around and around things and they'll go, I'm just rambling. I hear that a lot. And I say, no, it's okay. This is good. Talking through is good. And if I asked you to identify what exactly is the problem at this point, what would you say that is? So questions like that. Just be aware that the way you frame the questions can make all the difference. Leading questions are no good. We don't want to say, well, what if you talk to your boss about how you feel unappreciated? That's not a question. That's a suggestion. And again, I'll bring this back around to, if you want to be mentoring, great, be mentoring. Mentoring is really appropriate when someone doesn't have a lot of experience, doesn't have the knowledge, when you feel that they can't figure it out on their own and you want to offer advice. But I think advice is usually too freely given when it's not really what's needed or wanted. So I really hope we'll all check ourselves and say, is this an opportunity where I can coach, where I can ask those helpful questions, where I can listen and give the person the opportunity to think it through, paraphrase back what I'm hearing, and so that they can come up with their own solutions rather than me giving advice. We give too much advice in general. Think about being on the receiving end. When you go to someone with a problem, sometimes wouldn't it be nice to have this kind of approach where you get to do most of the talking, you get to think things through, and they just ask you these really great questions that help you arrive at new insights? At the conclusion of a coaching session, I like to tie things together and ask people about their takeaways and what actions they'd like to take based on the conversation. So that's where the questions are important as well. I might say, so what are you taking away from this conversation? I might say, what would you like to take action on that came out of this coaching session, something that helps them to leave the session feeling like they have an action plan, or at least they've summarized the takeaway, if it's a change in thoughts, if it's a change in the way they're feeling about something. And speaking of changing thoughts and feelings, please go back to episode number 2, which is the self-coaching model, which talks about how our thoughts create our feelings, which drive our actions, because I'm tempted, I'm wanting to get into all the amazing coaching tools and models and resources and frameworks that we have. But I'm reminding myself that's not for this conversation. This conversation is just the 3 core skills, general foundational skills for great coaching, but there are so many more for you to look into. And I have lots and lots of resources and information and podcast episodes. Remember, we have 30 episodes of the Right Questions podcast that goes into much more depth about coaching skills and techniques and topics. And I have webinars on the subject of coaching that I will link here. But in this session, I really wanted to offer these foundational skills that I think anybody can put into practice, really in any conversation. They're also just good communication skills in any conversation, and especially in conversations where we're trying to help someone. So I hope you have more clarity on the differences between, at least the beginning understanding of the differences between coaching and therapy, and coaching and mentoring and teaching. And you'll work on those 3 foundational skills with anyone who you might be engaging in a coaching conversation with. Thanks so much for joining me again. I really appreciate your support. And by the way, I have a new page on Instagram. It's called Growth and Gratitude Podcast. I would be so grateful if you would follow me there and share with others and let people know about my podcast. I want to reach as many people as possible and help them to live their best lives. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.